Emily Dickinson was an enigmatic, uniquely individual American poet. She grew up in a very religious family, and her early experiences in church, that's where she derived her hymn meter, which dominates her poems. Hymn meter is alternating lines of iambic tetrameter and trimeter. You don't have to know that, just know hymn meter, but it's, you know, the rhythm of most of the old hymns. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. So it's very regular, kind of rigid meter. She didn't follow it exactly, right? She has alterations in it, but overall, that's her meter, and it makes her a really interesting contrast because she has these poems that are very traditional in their structure, regular rhyme, regular meter, but her subject matter and her insights are very unorthodox. So while her family was Christian, she was certainly not Orthodox Christian. She reveals some pretty profound doubts in her poems. Not that, I mean, everyone has doubts, but she had, you know, some unorthodox beliefs. She, you know, her favorite subject, it seems, was death, which is not that surprising when you consider life in the 1800s. Death was less covered up, if you will, than it is in our culture. There is a lot more, you know, infant mortality and women dying in childbirth. We didn't have the medical advances we have now. And so anyway, many of her poems deal with death, and she's trying to take an honest look at death and you know, face it bravely. Dickinson was also a recluse. She never married. She never left her parents' house. She was educated, highly educated, in a school for girls. She had a really deep training and knowledge of and interest in science. And she was a keen observer of nature. You see that in many of her poems as well. She doesn't write the typical, you know, amateurish poems that kind of use cliches to describe nature. She describes nature really precisely and accurately. She, what else? Yep, already said she was very reclusive. Never married. So there are only 3 poems I'm going to ask you about on the final exam. Those are poem number 324, whose first line is "A bird came down the walk." Emily Dickinson did not title her poems, so they're known either by their number or just the first line of the poem. So "A bird came down the walk," number 324. "Tell all the truth, but tell it slant," number 1129. And "I heard a fly buzz before I died," poem number 465. So let's look at each of those in turn. "A bird came down the walk. He did not know I saw. He bit an angleworm in halves and ate the fellow raw." There again, you notice that regular meter. Also, Dickinson was very fond of using dashes. She sprinkled dashes throughout her poems. And there are different theories on why she did that or what effect it has, but we won't get into that. Just know that she did use dashes in interesting ways. So this is one of her poems where she keenly observes nature. And in this poem, I believe she's really kind of softly criticizing the way we humans tend to personify nature. We try to understand nature in our own terms. So a bird came down the walk. You know, we humans walk down a sidewalk, but birds don't necessarily follow the sidewalk or the highway. They make their own path. And so we're, again, projecting, you know, the way we do things onto a wild bird. He ate the fellow raw. Again, that's an example of how we personify. Of course, the bird ate the worm raw. It's not like a bird, you know, is going to throw the worm in the microwave. And then he drank a dew from a convenient grass and then hopped sidewise to the wall to let a beetle pass. Drank from a convenient grass evokes the thought of drinking from a glass. Again, I think she's making fun of how we personify nature. Also, this is a good example of how Dickinson used form to reinforce content. The same kind of thing we saw with Frederick Douglass, and you know, he would, and not until he would cease to swing the blood-clotted cowskin. Here, notice that the meter is very iambic throughout the poem. A bird came down the walk. He ate the fellow raw. Da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. But then we get to this line in the second stanza, and then hopped sidewise to the wall. There's a lot of spondaic meter there, you know, stressed syllables back to back. And notice how that mimics, though, the bird. Another thing in this poem is Dickinson keenly observes how a bird is really kind of awkward when it's on the ground. And so the meter in the first half of the poem kind of mirrors that, right? There's this kind of awkward meter. The bird, if you've ever watched a bird stumbling around on the ground, their legs are not really built for walking, but for perching. But then in the second half, so then we see that, and hopped sidewise to the wall. In my face classes, I always make a fool of myself and kind of dance, and hopped sidewise to the wall. And it just really, it shows the awkwardness of that rhythm. But that, again, that's form reinforcing content. And then when wall, she ends on that hard syllable, stress syllable, and it's almost like, you know, mimics the bird hitting the wall or something. But then he glanced with rapid eyes that hurried all around. They looked like frightened beads, I thought. He stirred his velvet head. That's a jarring unfulfillment of the rhyme scheme, right? We have walk, saw, halves, raw, dew, grass, wall, pass, eyes around, I thought, sound, or something that rhymes with round is what we expect, but he stirred his velvet head. I mean, that really sticks out like a sore thumb. And I think Dickinson does it on purpose, because right at that moment, the bird is jarred out of its complacency. It recognizes the poet's presence. And right after that, the bird flies off. And then the sounds of the poem become smoother, more euphonic. Cautious crumb feathers home, and oars divide the ocean to silver for a seam. So the alliteration, the assonance, or butterflies off banks of noon leap plashless as they swim. Plashless. Of course, she means splashless. That's not a typo or a misspelling. She deliberately takes the S out of the word splashless, so the word makes less of a splash when you pronounce it. It's like an onomatopoeic utilization there. And she's, you know, the bird is graceful, just like an Olympic diver strives to not make a splash when he or she enters the water. The bird flies seamlessly through the air in similar fashion. All right, so let's go to the next poem, Tell All the Truth, but Tell It Slant. This is poem 1129. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies, too bright for our infirm delight. The truth's superb surprise, as lightning to the children, eased with explanation kind. The truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. So what she's saying here is that as a poet, whereas in other kinds of writing, you make your point directly, right? in an argumentative essay, for instance, you directly state your thesis, you support it clearly. Poetry is different, though. Poetry does get at deep truths, but ironically, it doesn't do so directly, because sometimes it's more effective to express the truth indirectly. Now, she says we might be blinded if the truth is too blunt. Maybe in some cases, but I think her main point is just showing how poetry is a different form of writing than really any other kind of writing. So poets tell the truth, but they tell it slant. That doesn't mean they lie per se, but that they use indirection. They use metaphor, other poetic devices. Like the poem we just read, A Bird Came Down the Walk. The direct way of making the points we just discussed would be for her just to directly write, wow, isn't it weird how we personify nature and we project human, qualities onto birds? And isn't it interesting how birds are awkward on the ground, but are graceful when they fly? I mean, that would be the prose way of expressing those points. But there's a sense in which, that has its place, but there's a sense in which doing it indirectly, that the point we imbibe the point more deeply. We own it. We're more likely to own those insights when we have to kind of discover them, when they're given to us indirectly. The third poem, I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died. It's number 465. And again, this is a good example of, again, one of her many poems where she's preoccupied with death. Here it is. I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm. The eyes around had wrung them dry, and breaths were gathering firm for that last onset when the king be witnessed in the room. First of all, she's pointing out the irony that, when you think of a deathbed experience, you think of saying profound things, having deep thoughts, and the significance of everything is heightened. And yet instead, she writes about a fly, something seemingly trivial and beside the point. Also, of course, a fly is associated with death. But maybe one of the questions she's asking here is, well, maybe death, we make a big deal out of it, but maybe it's not that big of a deal, especially if there is nothing after death. If there's no afterlife and we just die and that's it, then, we want to believe there's some grand meaning or purpose. But what if a fly is buzzing around and that's no more or less important than a person's life and death? She says they're waiting for when the king be witnessed in the room. King, capital K. Presumably she's referring to Jesus. Well, isn't Jesus gonna enter the room and take the deceased to heaven? But she says, I willed my keepsakes, signed away what portion of me be assignable, and when it was there, interposed a fly with blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz between the light and me. So the light, again, if the light is God or Jesus being the light of the world, this fly is blocking the light. And then the windows failed, and then I could not see to see. So the poem kind of leaves us hanging in it, and she, exacerbates that sense by closing the poem with a dash. Also, this fly, I've heard critics, acknowledge that there's a tradition of Beelzebub, a demon who is called the Lord of the Flies, not the novel, the Lord of the Flies, but he's associated with flies. And so maybe this is kind of an allusion to that as well. So I believe that's it. Let me just make sure. Yeah, she does kind of suggest a connection perhaps between, physical seeing and spiritual seeing. She says, I could not see to see. So there's, is she suggesting that, well, as I'm physically dying, I'm literally, my physical eyesight is going, but then also I can't see the light in a spiritual sense. All right, that's it.